Delight Your Marriage, Episode 4.
Welcome to the Delight Your Marriage podcast, the show where you hear from amazing and inspiring wives sharing their struggles, triumphs, and advice for this journey called marriage. Here's your host, Belah Rose.
Hey, I'm so glad that you joined me today. Thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to be here with me. And I'm really excited because this is a fantastic interview with Jay Dee from a website called sexlessness.com. And he's going to talk about his journey in marriage with his wife. And it's pretty incredible. You can hear that they went through years of struggle and hardship and sexlessness in their marriage and addiction and just difficult things that is actually incredibly common, and people just aren't talking about it and the roots behind it. So it's really great. He's got some amazing insights, and he blogs about these kinds of issues all the time on his blog. So I really encourage you to check that out. And at the end of the episode, this is the first half of our interview, but at the end of this episode, he talks about the results of a really fascinating survey that literally almost made me tear up as he was reading it. So it's a pretty great episode. I think you're in for a treat. So I won't hold you up anymore. And here is the interview. Hi, Delight Your Marriage listeners. I'm so excited that you are here, and I am stoked to be with Jay Dee from sexlessness.com. How are you, Jay? Welcome.
I'm very well, thank you.
Great. Well, I'm really excited that you're here with us, and I think it's going to be awesome to hear a little bit more about your marriage and your journey. And I'd love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself and your family and a little bit about your day-to-day life.
All right. So I'm Jay, and my wife is Christina. She writes with me on my blog, so some people who know us might know her a bit. We have 4 children, with a 5th on the way, due any time in the next 3 weeks.
Wow.
And they're all ages 8 and under, so it's a very busy house. And on top of that, we homeschool as well, so that's usually when people's heads explode.
That's awesome. Yes. Well, I actually have a 6-week-old little boy as well. So,
fun.
And a 1.5-year-old, but the itty bitty ones are a lot of fun.
Yes.
That's awesome. So yes, very, very busy. Could you tell me a little bit about what it looks like day-to-day life for you all?
Well, day-to-day life, it depends. My job situation has recently changed. So for the last 7 years, I've been in one major contract, which just ended. And so right now I'm between contracts, which means for the last 2 months I've been at home and been able to just enjoy being with my family all day long. I really don't leave the house much anymore, except to go to church meetings because I sit on multiple teams on there. So,
Awesome.
So my day-to-day life now is not what has been normal. And it isn't normal for most people. So right now I get up in the morning. I've taken over the homeschooling because my wife is super pregnant. And so I do homeschooling with 3 of my kids, the 3 older ones, from like 9 in the morning till noon. And then in the afternoon, I work on the blog. I work on my marriage coaching practice, which I've just started up, and also work on trying to find new contracts for my other job, which is actually software engineering.
That's great. Well, I definitely want to hear also more about your coaching as well a little bit later on. And would you also share just a little bit about you and your wife's personalities?
Sure. So we are quite disparate in personalities. I'm a very logical, I like facts and figures, and I'm very black and white. I tend to be either something's, it's true or it's not true. That's kind of my big thing in life, is trying to figure out what is true. And my wife is a very opposite end. Like if I'm pretty sure I am on the Asperger's spectrum. That's how rigid I am in my structures in my head and conceptually. And she is the opposite. We're pretty for sure she's ADHD. So she's very much the wow, look at all the shiny things, and what's this thing over here, and what's this thing over here, and always likes to see what's new and what's different, and I want to try this. And I tend to be the people come to me and they're like, okay, I have a question and I need an answer, and people come to her when they're like, I feel sad and I want someone to be compassionate. And so we, despite being quite different, we tend to work together quite well as a team, because then I can be the hard-lined, this is the truth and what I believe, and she can be the, and this is why we love you.
That's awesome. Yeah, sounds like you both complement each other very well in those ways. That's awesome.
Yes, it took us quite a few years to figure these things out. At first, we fought all the time because we have such differing kind of views and lenses that we see the entire world through. And in 1 year, we figured out, both of them, that I probably have Asperger's syndrome and she probably has ADHD. And oh, wow, that just answers everything. And now we're like, and this is why you're doing that. And I can respond, and this is why you're doing that. And now we understand each other. And we don't get like upset and say, well, why are you doing this? We can kind of understand why we're doing it. And sometimes we can't help it. It's just the way our brains are formed. And sometimes it's, well, we could work on this thing and try to get a little bit better. But it definitely has made things easier.
Yeah, well, I love that insight, because it's just so important that frequently opposites attract. That's a very common thing in marriage. And to recognize that actually can be your strength. It doesn't have to be your weakness. It can be actually something that, just like you said, I love the example of, you might give the right answer and your wife might say, here's a hug. That's kind of how it's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing. And, that this podcast is really all about inspiring and empowering marriages and wives. And so I'd really love to hear a scripture or a quote that's meant a lot to you over the years.
I probably have two that have meant the most to me, and one is biblical and one is not, but they both deal with God. So I'll do the non-biblical one first. The first quote I ever remember in my entire life is from Galilei. And he said, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use. And for me, this is just this huge, like, I'm supposed to think through things. Where I grew up in a church that was very much, whenever I asked questions, I was always told, well, you just have to have faith, which drives me insane. Because for me, my faith is based on being able to see that God is logical. And I view the Bible, and the reason I believe the Bible is because it has this huge logical consistency within it. So to me, like my faith is based on, being able to see that and be able to think through things and work through things. And I know some people are very much the opposite. They're just like, well, I have faith, and so I'm just going to believe it. And that's good for them. It doesn't work for me. So for me, that was a huge thing that kind of ran my life, and especially when I was struggling when I was a teenager to get answers to questions, difficult questions. I was always running around asking, well, why is there a hell? And why is God sending people there? And like, how can he be loving, and things like that? And these are all questions that I basically got told, well, either you just have to have faith or stop showing up at this class.
Wow.
And then paired with that was, I'm a big fan of Solomon's writings, because he was considered to be the wisest man in the Bible in Earth's history. And so, he writes in Proverbs 4, verse 5, I think, just the first part, he says, get wisdom, get understanding. And for me, that's been like a driving force in my life. I want to know everything.
I love that. And I'm interested when you would venture out into the, understanding these big, giant questions that theologians debate about all the time. I mean, were you able to find answers that, or that satisfied you, or did it just, whet your appetite and just cause you to want to dive in deeper? How did you kind of?
Both. Some of my questions, they take me a decade to answer. I've read through the Bible cover to cover 3 or 4 times now. This time I'm trying to do it in Hebrew, so I have to teach myself Hebrew as I go, which is interesting. But that you get to learn even more things. So some of the questions, it's taken me a long time. Yeah, sometimes decades to go, oh, and that's why that happens, or this is why he didn't know this, things like that. Yeah. And other things, I'm like, I don't have the answer yet. I hope I'll get the answer someday, but if not, after reading through the Bible and learning all this stuff, I have seen enough to understand that God is perfect and his plan is perfect. And I can trust the holes that I haven't filled in yet to be filled in eventually.
Yeah. I love that. I'm right there with you. Wisdom is definitely one of my favorite words and favorite things to pursue. And I love also that, God tells us to love him with all of our heart, soul, and mind. And sounds like that's exactly what you've been pursuing, even from your first quote to your second. So I just love that. And I'd love to hear how wisdom a lot of times is learned through the fire, is learned in the midst of the storms. And so I'm interested in hearing a bit about your season in marriage that was a struggle for you all and kind of how you all went through that.
Probably the most difficult part in our marriage was right off the bat. We got married and we didn't know anything about marriage. Like it seems that we grew up and got no training on the subject whatsoever. Which is unfortunate because I read so many things in the Bible about how you should train up your children to be good spouses and older ones should teach the younger one. Sorry, my daughter is interrupting me.
Speaking of younger ones.
No.
Go ahead.
So right off the bat, we had struggles because we had never learned how to communicate properly as spouses. We didn't learn anything about sex growing up. It was basically don't ask questions, right? Which I think is a lot of the Christian experience is, sex is bad, don't do it. And don't ask questions about it because that's bad too. Right. And all of a sudden we get married and we're supposed to have this flip. Okay, well, sex is good, but you still can't ask questions. It's starting to change a little bit, and there's a lot of us in the marriage blogging community, I think yourself included, that are trying to drive these discussions a bit to try to solve some of that. But I came into our marriage dealing with a porn addiction since I don't even know how young. Probably I got my first computer when I was 16, so I was at least 4 years in, because I'm very technically inclined. I'm a software engineer by trade. And I have been since I was 12. I've been pulling apart computers and figuring out everything. So I was on the internet before there was an internet. And as soon as people started connecting computers together, the first thing that gets shared is pornography and erotic literature and all this other stuff. So by 14, 15, 16, I had already found it all. So that's where I was in our marriage, or in our kind of the sex ideas that we brought in. And then my wife, because she didn't get told anything other than what good Christian girls typically get told, which is sex is bad, don't have sex. And so on my side, I'm dealing with a porn addiction. On her side, she's dealing with all these thoughts that I'm not supposed to like sex. Sex is not a good thing. And so for the first probably 7 years of our marriage, 6, 7, we basically had a sexless marriage, which gets defined as 10 times or less per year. And I know during one part, I think when we had our second child, maybe our first one, we had a 9-month stretch where we didn't see each other naked even. We never had sex, and we never went to bed at the same time because it was too hard. And we weren't talking about it because you don't talk about sex. And finally, we kind of woke up and realized we need to change something in our marriage or we're not going to make it. I mean, we don't believe in divorce, and we both are on the same page on that, but we're going to hate each other. We might not get divorced, but I might kill you kind of thing. Right. And right. And we almost get this, I don't know, in when I grew up, it was almost, you had that feeling that divorce is worse than murder. And at some point, if you don't start working on things, and you're constantly in this struggle, and every time you talk, it turns into a fight because you've all this stuff pent up and everything. That eventually you start thinking like horrible things, about, well, I can't get divorced, but maybe I'll die. Like, and it's not quite suicidal, but you're at the point where they're like, there is probably no light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. And I remember for a long time, my hope was that I had heard that women sometimes, when they get into their mid-30s, that all of a sudden their sex drive increases. And that was my light at the end of the tunnel when I was 23, that in a decade and a half, maybe this will turn around.
Wow.
And I'm not even sure what Christina's light at the end of the tunnel was, if there was one at all. So that was our biggest struggle in our marriage. And then eventually we kind of just went, okay, we need to start working on stuff or else we're not going to make it. So we started looking around and like, okay, what are the biggest struggles in our marriage? And we weren't quite ready to deal with the whole sex thing yet. So we started with finances because money's a little safer to talk about, not much. So we spent 2 years working on finances, and we learned how to budget, and we actually started tithing for the first time in our marriage. And all these things, like I read through the Bible because that's my tendency is to do, and find all the scriptures on money, which turns out there's more on money than any other topic. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And so we fixed that, and we started budgeting, and we're like, okay, we've got finances kind of sorted out. We're not out of the hole because we made a mess of that too. Again, no training. And then we're like, okay, next step is communication. Because every time we talk, we get into a fight. So we learned how to communicate better, and we learned how to ask questions in the right way, and how to not get mad when we ask, when we get confronted with something. And then once those two things, those were kind of like big, weighty, daily kind of things that were weighing on us. And then we finally said, okay, now we need to address kind of this sex thing. And at this point, my wife still, she had no idea I was still watching porn for the last 5 years of our marriage, plus the 5 years before that. So, but she realized that, she was contributing to the problem as well in being like a refuser and gatekeeping kind of sex, saying, well, no, we're not going to have it. So I think she probably actually made the first step and said, she spent a lot of time working through that, and one day actually made a promise to me, and she said, I will never say no again. Which I have to admit, I didn't believe her. And now I definitely believe her, and she doesn't say no. She will say, I'm really tired. And usually then I'll tell her, okay, let's go to sleep. But I think, and one of the things that we did, and she kind of did this to almost prove, right, that what I'm saying is real, is we did this 7 days of sex challenge that I think I saw on One Extraordinary Marriage, which is another podcast by Christians about sex. And we did that, and she said it, like, let's do this thing. And I was like, there's no way you're going to last 2 days. Like, but okay. And we ended up having sex 10 days in a row, taking a 1 day break, and then doing another 12. And it completely changed our marriage around. And then all of a sudden, my brain was like, okay, well, now you don't need all this other stuff. And so I quit porn and then told her that this is what I'd been struggling with. So I didn't actually come out until I dropped it. Because I'm a man and we're scared of things like intimacy and being vulnerable, and we like to fix things before we actually tell people we had a problem, and now I solved it.
Yeah.
So that's our big giant struggle for the first 8 years of our marriage.
I just love that you're sharing so openly this struggle, because it's just such a common struggle. It's just so many marriages' story, and yet no one is talking about it. And thankfully you are on your blog. It's an amazing blog. So if you haven't checked out Sex Within Marriage, you really need to. But it's just a very, very common struggle, and porn even more so, maybe more so, is a huge struggle that people just don't talk about. And it's something that even as a young woman, I struggled with coming upon it was a site for homework. And then, I talk about that a little bit on my blog as well, but it's just a huge thing. And I want to talk a little bit about how you were able to kind of get out of the pornography, because I know that there's so many people that are listening that, this is the issue, and it's driving a wedge in between their marriage, and it's causing them so much guilt and shame because it feels like you're living a double life. And there's just, it's just a really hard thing that like billions of people are struggling with. So.
Yeah. The numbers we typically see is about 50% within the church are currently struggling with porn. And I've seen surveys where they surveyed pastors, and it's the same number. It's still 50%.
Oh man.
And I know I talk to most of the pastors that I know well enough to talk to, and I'm seeing the same thing. The one that will admit to it. Yeah, I've struggled with it. I've been very blessed to have pastors who are transparent, and we'll talk about these things. Unfortunately, I wish I had learned to talk to them before I got married, and actually already had resolved their issues. But how did I deal with it? I see, that's the problem. I cheated by having a wife that was willing to say, I will have sex with you every night for 2 weeks. And that's not advice I can give to most husbands. When wives come to me and say, we're having this struggle in our marriage, what do? I say, you need to tell him, I'm going to help you with this. And I will be there whenever you need, barring the obvious, look, I'm at work, so we can't do it right now, or it's Thanksgiving dinner and everybody's over. We're not going to sneak off and go have sex. But that's not typically times that he'd go on and sneak off and go watch porn anyway, so that shouldn't be an issue. So I tell, one of the best things I've heard, and I can't remember where I heard it, is to have this policy, and it's kind of crude, but they say the policy is in me or on me. Like, if you're going to have an orgasm, like the wife should say, it better be on me or in me, nowhere else. If I'm not involved, then I'm considering that cheating.
Wow.
And I think that's the best advice I can give to wives. For their husbands, the best advice is to come clean to your wives. Because as soon as they know what's going on, all of a sudden you have this layer of accountability, and you don't want to let them down. And now there's a spotlight on it, and it's a lot harder to continue doing something wrong when somebody knows you're doing it.
Yep.
But that's really hard to do, because it requires saying, I'm hurting and I'm doing something wrong and I'm stuck and I can't help myself.
Top of that, the way pornography feels to a woman is just so painful. But I would be really interested in hearing how a man thinks about that, because for a woman, it feels like he's cheating on me, but for the man, it doesn't feel like that. What does it feel like for a man?
I can't speak for all men. I could try to extrapolate based on who I've talked to and my own experiences. But I know for a lot of them, it's less about sex and more about intimacy. There's this, and it's not all men. Like, some men are in marriages and they're having regular sex and they're still stuck in porn.
Yep.
And I think a lot of them, it might just be a straight addiction. And then you're dealing with something almost a little easier, because if it's straight, like, psychological addiction, that's a little easier to break, because you have a marriage to fall back on that's mostly stable, more likely stable. But it's in the marriages where they're not having sex, they're in a sexless marriage, or their frequency is very, very low, like on that borderline kind of clinical sexless term, like 10 times a year or less, that often what they're looking for is a sense of intimacy. And this whole feeling of orgasm makes us feel good, because we get this huge rush of oxytocin, which is this hormone in us that makes us feel bonded and safe and secure. And I think God designed it to be that we feel this when we're with our spouses, and it binds us together. It makes us feel safe and secure. And I don't know if other people have noticed, but if you can have a conversation right after your husband has had an orgasm, it will probably be the best conversation of your marriage, because right at that moment, he feels absolutely secure and safe and happy. And if you can manage to get him not to fall asleep, you can have some really good conversations.
Yep, very true.
and women drive on oxytocin. They have, I think it's 7 times the level of oxytocin that men have in their bodies at any given period. The only time we get close is the 30 minutes after an orgasm, and then it levels off again, and we're back to normal. and so we see this constant struggle. That's why generally, not all the time, but generally, men, if they haven't had sex in a couple of days, they're like, I don't feel loved anymore. Because they're completely depleted of oxytocin. It's gone. They're like on empty. And their wives are still like, I feel fine. Like, because they generate so much of this stuff just in and of themselves. So I think for a lot of men, it's much more of an intimacy thing. I mean, there's definitely the whole, it excites your brain, and there's the whole physical feeling and everything like that. But that can be replaced, right, by your spouse. Right. If you have a spouse who shows genuine interest in you and is willing to have fun in the bedroom, not just be like, okay, it's duty sex time, let's go have it. Hurry up.
Oh no.
Then and that's what I see. A lot of the men say, I finally kicked porn, and it only happened after our marriage started getting better and we started having more sex. And it's, I think a lot of it is driven by this issue of intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that insight. And I think it gives so much hope to wives listening that if you found out about an addiction that your husband has to porn, there's hope in that. There's hope in this story from Jay. And it's my experience as well, is that when sex is happening in the marriage, it doesn't have to be happening on the computer. It's something that you can change in your marriage. And I know as a wife and as a woman, I think the intimacy piece, hearing that that's what's happening through the pornography addiction, that helps us to understand and to forgive and to move forward and to say, it's not that he's choosing or trying to necessarily choosing this other, these pictures above you. If you could give to him what he needs, it's possible to really move past that. And so I just want to encourage wives out there that it's going to take a lot of support, and you might need to reach out to other wives that can support you in this, and to get to a place of healing and forgiveness, but to also get to action where you can be helping him through this. You can be potentially making a way that he can, like you said, kick the habit, Yeah.
Now, it's not everybody there. I definitely come in contact with wives that say, no, we have an active, healthy sex life, and he's still addicted to porn. What do I do? And I basically said, he needs accountability. Like, you can't keep this in the dark. Go and get him to talk to his pastor or someone else in his church, someone he trusts. Chances are the person he's talked to, he's got a 50-50 chance of saying they're struggling with it too. And if they're not, there's a pretty good chance they have in the past and they kicked it. Right. And they know where he is. And I don't know what that number is of people who have dealt with porn in the past, but if it's 50% now are struggling with it, I'd imagine it's a pretty high number of people in our church that have either are currently struggling with it or have in the past. I think most people are afraid of, like, oh no, if people found out, my life would be ruined. And I think a lot of people would be like, no, if they found out, they'd be like, yeah, me too, buddy. I'm struggling with that too. We should form a group. Like, and I know for a lot of us, like for myself, I knew it was wrong. Half the time I'd rationalize it and say, well, my wife doesn't want me, so it must be okay, kind of thing. Or, whatever. You find ways to rationalize it.
So the process of kind of getting out of this, it sounds like, was a lot of your wife's proactivity. I mean, did you feel that you were a part of things working better, or how did it kind of go?
Definitely. I mean, I've always been kind of the researcher in the realm of marriage and sex because, well, I've been fascinated with sex since I was a teenager. Never really went away. So I was constantly sending stuff, to my wife. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And I think earlier on, I don't think I did that early on in our marriage, but once we had actually started kind of talking about things and realizing we had issues and we have to fix them, because I think for the first while, we actually thought, well, this is normal. Everyone hates their spouses. Because all we hear is like, oh, marriage is hard work. And we're like, okay, so it's hard work. And there's no joy. I think about 5 years in, I started sending her like articles I had seen from some of the early bloggers or threads on the Marriage Bed, which is a forum for discussing sexuality and marriage from a Christian perspective as well. And one day she read something, and it was talking about refusers, which is the term kind of we give to spouses who say, no, we're not having sex. And she flat out asked me one night, do you think I'm a refuser? And me being the not always so compassionate or politically correct answer said yes. And then she was like, oh, okay. And that was kind of it for the night, I think. But after that was, I think, what started her big shift. For her to actually, like, she saw in herself, what I'm doing is not right. And not that what I was doing was right by any means, but she managed to beat me at tackling her issues before mine. And so did I play a part in it? I think I definitely did play a part in it. And I was, as much as, I said, yes, you definitely fall within that category of refuser as we define it, kind of thing. My wife tends to beat herself up a little bit, like, oh, I'm not good enough kind of thing. At least she used to. She's getting much better at that. But, I would always constantly say, no, you're my wife. Despite all our problems, I still love you the way you are. I want us to be better, but it's not that you're not good enough. So I was constantly trying to reaffirm her. And every step that she took or backslid or whatever, I was always trying to say, it's okay. It's the fact that you're working on it is amazing. Yeah. I think I don't see that in a lot of spouses. Like a lot of them that come to me, they say things like, well, if she tells me no one more time, I'm going to divorce her. And I'm like, but she's been working on it. Why would you do that? Like, why? You need to recognize that she's human. She's sinful, just as you are. Even when we try to work on our marriages, it's not going to be perfect. We're going to mess up. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to backslide and say no to sex, or we're going to backslide and watch something we weren't supposed to watch, or porn, or read something, or whatever. And I see it from wives too, that I'd be like, no, if I ever caught my husband watching porn, that's it. We'd be divorced. And I'd be like, really, for one thing, you divorce him? I mean, how many times have you done something wrong in your marriage? You can't be perfect. But we tend to pick and choose these kind of things that, oh, this is worse than this one. And in a lot of people's minds, I hear it from a lot of wives that say, no, if I ever catch him watching porn, we're divorced. And I'm like, well, you got a 50% chance of catching him. Like, you might not want to decide on that right now.
Yeah. I think as a wife, we need to recognize that in our husbands, that this is a significant temptation and a significant reality that many, many men struggle with. And it's because we're designed and wired to really enjoy sex and really let it be such a bonding experience between man and wife. So anyway, I venture to say that, Jay, some of the things that you're saying may be completely perspective shifting for some of our listeners, because I think that's common. I think women are so threatened by pornography because it, just like you said, the thing that I think we struggle with probably the most in intimacy is I'm not good enough. I'm not sexy enough. I don't look good enough. I'm not all of these things. And so as a husband, I love that, your tactic was really to be affirming and to really say, you are good enough. And this is I want you exactly how you are. How do you think wives can get over themselves in that mind game of I'm not good enough? How can they kind of be proactive and do that?
I think that's an issue even regardless of the porn.
Mm.
Like, I think a lot of wives, actually, I ran a survey once because a wife emailed me and said, I don't think my husband finds me attractive.
Mm.
And she's like, it's not based on anything or whatsoever, but I just have this sinking feeling that he doesn't. So I ran a survey because it was an anonymous question. I couldn't respond back to this person. I had no contact information for them whatsoever. So I ran a survey basically asking wives and husbands, how attracted are you to your spouse? And how attracted do you think they are to you?
Mm.
And I can't remember what the number was for wives. I think it was something like under 40% of wives felt that they were attractive to their spouse, like to their husband. And 96% of the husbands said, no, I'm definitely attracted to my wife. In fact, 96% said as much or more so than when we got married.
Wow.
96. And of the other 4%, they weren't like, no, I don't find my wife attractive. They were just like, well, maybe not as attractive as when she was 20. Like, and for those 4%, I'm still like, what are you kidding? Like, but it was such an overwhelming response, and I was like, wow, 96%. And so I posted this thing, and immediately I got this other email like the next day, and from this same woman who had asked the original question, and she was basically told me she was in tears reading the survey results. She said, I had no idea, and she's like, I wonder how many other women struggle with this too. And I'm like, well, I can tell you from the data, most of them.
Right.
And so I think there's this huge issue.
Yeah, Jay, I'm going to have to stop the episode here, but when he said that, and during the interview, I literally was starting to tear up. I mean, it's just something that women don't realize, that they are so gorgeous. They're so valuable. They're so beloved by our Creator God and by our husbands. So, Jay, thank you so much. You just had incredible insights and wisdom, and the next episode is chock full of a lot more, so definitely check that out once it comes out. But I want to mention, if this is maybe one of the first times that you're really getting exposed to the male psyche and how he thinks about sex and what it means to him as a man, I'd really encourage you. I've written a book called Delight Your Husband, and it's really getting women through each one of their reservations. So that includes whether or not sex is godly, what he thinks about sex. It's also going through all of women's insecurities in terms of our body image, in terms of being vulnerable in front of our husband. And then it also goes through the very specifics of delighting your husband in the bedroom. So there's a lot of things that women can be insecure about. And one of them definitely is whether or not I'm doing this right, or is this the right way of going about it? So I really encourage you to check that out, delightyourhusband.com. And it's just a wonderful resource. It's also a workbook to really get women to go through and process all of these fears and anxieties and emotions to get to the other side and really feel confident and free in your marriage and in your bedroom. So really encourage that. But again, thank you so much for joining me today. And there is a lot more to come. And I really believe that it's going to be a delight to your marriage. So God bless you. I love you. And I'm praying for your marriage. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Stop by delightyourmarriage.com to check out all the show notes, as well as many more resources and articles. Until next time, live with love, wisdom, and passion.